Sloane's fingers froze mid-reach for the water pitcher when she noticed the new server's hands, calloused in ways that had nothing to do with carrying trays, positioned with the unconscious readiness of someone trained to draw a weapon. 8 months working at Aurelio's had taught her to read the subtle language of Portland's most exclusive dining room, but this man's presence screamed dissonance. The Wednesday evening crowd filled the restaurant with its usual symphony of crystal touching crystal, murmured conversations about mergers and gallery openings, the occasional burst of laughter from the bar. Sloane moved through it all with practiced efficiency, her nursing textbooks waiting in her locker for the post-shift study session that would stretch past midnight. She'd learned hypervigilance from her mother, whose anxiety disorder had transformed their home into a constant drill of exit strategies and threat assessments. What began as childhood survival had evolved into involuntary cataloging. Every face, every inconsistency, every detail that didn't belong. Table 7 held its usual occupant, the man who arrived precisely at 8 every Wednesday and departed exactly 90 minutes later. Davies possessed the kind of quiet authority that made seasoned restaurateurs behave like nervous apprentices, his tailored suit probably costing more than her entire semester's tuition. The false server had been introduced during the evening briefing as temporary coverage for sick leave, but his eyes had scanned the dining room like a tactical assessment. He wore rubber-soled boots instead of required leather dress shoes, and his questions about table assignments focused entirely on the northwest corner where Davies always sat. Sloane watched him refill water glasses with mechanical precision, his left hand staying too close to his torso. The subtle bulk beneath his server's jacket was inconsistent with the slim-fit uniform issued by management, and every circuit brought him closer to table 7. The kitchen staff had never seen him before tonight, she'd confirmed during a quick exchange while picking up orders. The manager's explanation about the staffing agency had sounded rehearsed, delivered with the slightly elevated pitch that indicated deception. Sloane had memorized the faces of every regular employee during her 8 months at Aurelio's, a habit born from the same instinct that made her count emergency exits. The false server's badge looked legitimate enough, but the plastic still carried that fresh-from-the-printer sheen, and his fingerprints smudged across its surface suggested recent handling rather than weeks of wear. She'd noticed him checking his watch 3 times in the past 20 minutes, each glance accompanied by subtle adjustment of his stance. The movements weren't about time management. They were countdown markers, the kind of nervous ritual people performed when approaching a deadline that couldn't be postponed. His breathing had changed too, shifting from normal service rhythm into something more controlled and deliberate. The false server's questions to other staff members had revealed another inconsistency. He didn't know basic details about the restaurant's layout or procedures. He'd asked where to find dessert spoons after working supposedly 2 hours, inquired about table numbering systems that were clearly marked, and showed confusion about the kitchen's traffic patterns that any real employee would have absorbed immediately. Portland's October evening had brought typical clientele through Aurelio's doors. Tech executives celebrating funding rounds, lawyers entertaining corporate clients, the occasional politician maintaining relationships that required discretion. But Davies remained the only guest who transformed the entire staff's demeanor, whose reservation prompted management to personally inspect his table setting and verify wine temperature before his arrival. Davies ordered his standard bourbon neat and opened his leather journal to a page filled with neat handwriting. But Sloane had observed him long enough to detect the microscopic tells. The way his eyes tracked peripheral movement, the angle of his shoulders suggesting readiness despite relaxed posture. The false server made his move during the dinner rush, when attention fragmented across dozens of simultaneous demands. He repositioned himself near the station closest to table 7, his path requiring no legitimate reason to be there, his focus narrowing with predatory intensity. Sloane's heart hammered against her ribs as she grabbed a cloth napkin from the service stand. Her pen, borrowed from her apron pocket, where she kept notes about medication schedules for studying, felt heavy as she scrawled 9 words in compressed block letters. The message took form in seconds. Listen, fake waiter, armed, left side. She folded the napkin into a precise rectangle, the fabric concealing her handwriting, and lifted the dessert menu from its display stand with fingers that somehow remained steady. Her approach to table 7 felt like walking through water, each step requiring conscious effort while her peripheral vision tracked the false server's position. Davies glanced up from his journal as she arrived, his expression polite but distant, the mask of a man accustomed to service. Sloane placed the dessert menu at the table's edge and set the folded napkin directly beneath his right hand. Her voice emerged calm and professional as she asked if he required anything else, though her pulse roared in her ears like standing too close to ocean waves. Davies's fingers touched the napkin, lifted it slightly, his eyes dropping to read what she'd written. The change in him was microscopic, a fractional tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible shift in his breathing pattern, but she saw the moment comprehension landed. His gaze lifted to meet hers for exactly 2 seconds. Those eyes were winter gray, carrying the kind of cold assessment that made her understand why managers became servants in his presence, and in their depths, she saw acknowledgement and something that might have been respect. He stood with fluid grace, folding the napkin and tucking it into his jacket pocket as if it were simply another business document. His movement toward the kitchen was unhurried, conversational even, as he caught the manager's attention with a subtle gesture that required immediate compliance. The manager's face drained of color as Davies spoke quietly near the kitchen entrance. Within seconds, Davies had disappeared through the swinging doors that led to the prep area and service alley beyond, leaving behind only the faint scent of expensive cologne and the weight of what Sloane had just set in motion. The false server's head snapped toward table 7 the moment he registered Davies's absence. His professional mask fractured, revealing something feral underneath as his hand moved toward his jacket's interior with purpose that no longer pretended hospitality. Sloane forced herself to continue her route through adjacent tables, collecting empty plates and refilling wine glasses as if the world hadn't just tilted. Her hands moved through familiar motions while her mind screamed warnings about what happened when you inserted yourself into situations that existed beyond civilian understanding. The kitchen doors burst open, and Davies emerged flanked by 2 men in chef's whites who moved nothing like culinary staff. Their positioning was tactical, their attention fixed on the false server with professional intensity, and the entire dining room seemed to hold its breath without knowing why. The false server's calculation played across his face in rapid succession. Fight, flight, the mathematics of survival against impossible odds. He chose retreat, backing toward the main entrance with his hand still hovering near the concealed weapon, his eyes darting between Davies's companions and the nearest exit. But Davies had already moved to intercept the front approach, his phone pressed to his ear with the casual authority of someone whose calls were always answered. The false server pivoted toward the emergency exit near the restrooms, his professional disguise abandoned entirely as he shouldered past a startled couple. The emergency door's alarm should have shrieked when he hit the bar, but only silence followed his exit into the night. Someone had disabled the system, Sloane realized, either in preparation for escape or as part of a plan that had just collapsed into chaos. Davies followed through the same exit with predatory calm, the door closing behind him with a soft click that somehow felt more ominous than any alarm. The 2 men in chef's whites positioned themselves at the emergency door, their presence preventing curious staff or patrons from investigating further. The dining room continued its oblivious rhythm while violence unfolded just beyond the walls. Couples shared desserts, business associates sealed deals with handshakes, and the pianist in the corner maintained his gentle interpretation of jazz standards. The disconnect between the 2 realities made Sloane feel like she was watching the world through distorted glass, seeing the surface while knowing what lurked underneath. She caught fragments of whispered conversation between the hostess and a senior server, their speculation ranging from celebrity incidents to kitchen accidents. One theorized about health inspections, another suggested mechanical failures, but their theories circled around plausible explanations that avoided the truth their instincts probably recognized. Nobody wanted to acknowledge what they all suspected, that Aurelio's served more than just food. The false server's abandoned station remained untouched, his section's tables now being covered by other staff without comment or question. His personal items had been removed from the employee area with efficiency that suggested practice protocol, and within 15 minutes, it was as if he'd never existed. The erasure felt more disturbing than his presence had been. Sloane's hands moved through service routines while her mind raced with questions she couldn't ask and answers she didn't want confirmed. The sounds from the alley had lasted perhaps 30 seconds, brief enough to suggest professional efficiency, long enough to confirm that someone had paid a permanent price for whatever had been attempted against Davies. Sloane stood frozen near table 7, her tray of empty glasses forgotten as she strained to hear anything from beyond the walls. The dining room's ambient noise seemed obscenely normal. Laughter from the bar, the clink of silverware against porcelain, a woman's delighted gasp at some shared secret. Then came the sounds that didn't belong, muffled impact against brick, a brief scuffle, and the kind of abrupt silence that follows violence. Her nursing training provided unwanted clinical details about what those sounds might represent, the force required to produce them, the probable outcomes for the human body. 90 seconds passed in stretch time before Davies re-entered through the emergency door, His suit remained immaculate, his breathing unchanged, but something in his eyes had sharpened, the look of a predator confirming a kill, though his hands showed no evidence of direct involvement. The manager materialized at Davies' elbow with supernatural speed, his face pale and anxious as he received quiet instructions. Within minutes, the manager was addressing the dining room with practiced apologies about a gas leak requiring immediate evacuation, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Staff moved with coordinated efficiency that suggested prior drilling for exactly this scenario. Patrons were ushered toward exits with complimentary bottles of wine and vouchers for future meals, their irritation soothed by generosity that ensured no one would question the disruption too closely. Sloane found herself swept toward the employee exit with the rest of the staff, everyone receiving sealed envelopes containing full night's wages plus substantial bonuses. The manager's brief speech about gas company protocols and reopening schedules sounded hollow, but no one dared voice the obvious questions. She changed quickly in the locker room, pulling her jacket over her uniform and shoving her textbooks into her backpack. The other servers whispered speculation that died whenever management passed, their theories ranging from celebrity incidents to health code violations, none approaching the truth. The walk to the bus stop carried her through streets that suddenly felt hostile despite their familiar configuration. Every parked car might contain observers, every shadowed doorway might hide consequences, and the cool October air raised goosebumps that had nothing to do with temperature. Her bus arrived on schedule, its interior lighting harsh and fluorescent after the restaurant's ambient glow. Sloane claimed a seat near the middle, positioning herself where she could monitor both exits, and watched Portland's downtown slide past the windows, like a city she no longer quite recognized. The question that had been building since Davies read her warning finally crystallized into words that played on repeat through her exhausted mind. Had she saved a life tonight, or had she simply chosen sides in a war she didn't understand? Morning arrived with pale sunlight filtering through Sloane's apartment blinds, and the immediate recognition that the black sedan parked across the street hadn't been there when she'd fallen asleep. The vehicle sat 3 spaces down from the building entrance, its tinted windows preventing identification of the occupant, its engine off but presence deliberate. She dressed for her early lecture while tracking the sedan's position through her second-floor window. The driver never emerged, never moved, but she felt the weight of observation like physical pressure against her skin, the same sensation that had kept her mother checking locks obsessively after the incident that had fractured their family's sense of safety. Her usual route to campus required passing directly by the sedan, so Sloane altered her pattern by exiting through the building's rear service entrance. The detour added 15 minutes to her commute, but provided the illusion of control over a situation that had clearly spiraled beyond her influence. The bus ride passed without incident, until she noticed the motorcycle that had followed her bus through 3 unnecessary turns. The rider wore anonymous black gear and maintained perfect spacing, close enough for surveillance, distant enough to avoid obvious detection, and her pulse began the familiar acceleration of recognized threat. Campus provided temporary sanctuary through sheer population density. Sloane lost herself in the crowd of students moving between buildings, her backpack heavy with textbooks that suddenly seemed absurdly normal compared to the reality unfolding around her. The nursing building's familiar corridors offered no comfort when she noticed the same man from her morning commute standing near the vending machines on her floor. He'd changed clothes, different jacket, different shoes, but faces were harder to disguise, especially to someone trained in observation. His presence here, in a building requiring student ID access, meant resources and planning beyond casual surveillance. Her study group met in the library's 3rd floor, but Sloane found herself unable to focus on pharmacology discussions while monitoring exits and cataloging faces. Her classmates discussed drug interactions and dosage calculations. Their concerns centered on upcoming exams, and she felt the gulf between their worlds widening with each passing moment. They worried about grades while she worried about survival. The afternoon shift change in surveillance teams happened with practiced coordination. Gray SUV departing as a dark blue sedan took position across from the library entrance. Sloane watched through the window while pretending to review her notes, recognizing the handoff as confirmation that she warranted round-the-clock monitoring. The resources being dedicated to watching her suggested value she didn't understand or threat she couldn't measure. She tried calling the restaurant's main line during a break between classes, hoping for normal conversation with familiar coworkers, but the number went straight to a recorded message about temporary closure. The voicemail offered no timeline for reopening, no explanation beyond vague references to facility maintenance, and the disconnect felt like another thread severing her from the life she'd built before that Wednesday night. But the coffee shop where she usually studied between classes contained a man who didn't belong. Mid-30s, wearing business casual that was slightly wrong for Portland's tech casual culture, his attention on a laptop that never quite held his focus. He'd positioned himself with clear sightlines to the entrance, and when Sloane entered, his eyes tracked her with professional assessment. She ordered her usual latte and claimed a corner table, forcing herself to open her pharmacology textbook, while her mind cataloged everything wrong about the situation. The man's coffee sat untouched and cooling, his typing irregular and performative, his presence explained by nothing except the need to monitor her location. 40 minutes into her study session, the man received a phone call that made him stand abruptly and exit. Through the window, Sloane watched him speak urgently to someone in a different vehicle, a gray SUV that had just pulled to the curb, before climbing into the passenger seat. The phantom sensation of crosshairs settled between her shoulder blades, that hyper-vigilant awareness screaming danger in frequencies only she could hear. Every person who entered the coffee shop became potential threat. Every vehicle passing outside might contain consequences she'd triggered with 9 words on a napkin. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother's assisted living facility, routine medication reminder that felt surreal against the current backdrop. Sloane's mother lived in managed care precisely because her anxiety disorder had made independent living impossible, and the bitter irony wasn't lost that the daughter might now have legitimate reasons for the same paranoid vigilance. The afternoon lecture on trauma nursing felt like cosmic mockery as the professor detailed treatment protocols for gunshot wounds. Sloane took mechanical notes while remembering the muffled sounds from the alley, the clinical details her training provided about what Davies had likely done to the false server in those 90 seconds of silence. Wednesday arrived with the weight of established pattern, Davies' usual night at Aurelio's, except the restaurant remained closed with apologetic signage about equipment repairs. Sloane's shift had been canceled via group text that offered no timeline for reopening, and the lack of information felt more ominous than any explanation. She spent the evening in her apartment with double-locked doors and curtains drawn, trying to focus on an essay about ethical considerations in emergency medicine. The assignment required discussion of duty to treat versus personal safety, and her answers emerged darker and more cynical than any professor would expect. The black sedan returned that night, parking in the same position as before, but with a different driver visible during the brief moment when interior lights illuminated the vehicle during shift change. They were rotating surveillance, she realized, which meant this wasn't casual observation, but coordinated operation. Sleep came in fractured intervals broken by phantom sounds and scenarios her imagination constructed with clinical detail. In the darkness, Sloane replayed her decision to write that warning, searching for the moment when she could have chosen differently, could have remained invisible instead of becoming whatever she was now. Thursday brought a delivery that shouldn't have been possible, a package addressed to her apartment despite her name not being listed on any building registry. Inside, wrapped in anonymous brown paper, was a new smartphone still in its factory packaging, expensive and untraceable. The phone powered on to reveal a single programmed contact with no name, just the word safety, and a number with an area code she didn't recognize. No instructions accompanied the device, but its message was clear. She was now connected to something that existed outside normal communication channels. Her mother's facility called that afternoon, with news that seemed too convenient to be coincidence. An anonymous donor had established a care fund covering all medical expenses, medications, and specialized therapy sessions. The administrator couldn't provide donor details due to legal arrangements, but the funding was legitimate and immediate. Sloane stood in her apartment, holding the anonymous phone while watching the surveillance sedan through her window, understanding finally crystallizing into terrible clarity. She wasn't just being watched, she was being claimed, her life systematically reorganized by forces that operated beyond law or conventional morality, and the only question remaining was whether this represented protection or a different kind of imprisonment. 4 weeks passed in suffocating routine, surveillance that never ceased, anonymous benefits that continued appearing, and the growing certainty that her independence had become negotiable currency. Sloane maintained her nursing courses while working reduced shifts at a different location, each day blending into the next under the weight of constant observation. The call came on a Tuesday evening, the anonymous phone vibrating against her kitchen counter with jarring intensity. She stared at the device for 3 rings before answering, her voice emerging steadier than she felt when she said hello into the void. "Aurelio's reopens tomorrow. Your shift begins at 6. The voice was male, professional, and offered no room for negotiation. Before the line went dead, Wednesday arrived with the inevitability of scheduled execution. Sloane dressed in her server's uniform and took the bus downtown, noting that the surveillance sedan followed at a discreet distance, but made no attempt to conceal its presence anymore. The restaurant looked unchanged from outside, but crossing the threshold felt like entering foreign territory. The staff moved with nervous energy, their conversations dying when she approached, and the manager's greeting carried forced normalcy that fooled no one. Table 7 sat empty during the early evening service, its usual occupant absent, while Sloane worked through her section with mechanical precision. She'd almost convinced herself that Davies had moved on to other venues when the hostess approached at 8 o'clock with a reservation change. "Table 7 requests you specifically," the hostess said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He's here with someone. They asked for the private corner section." Sloane's hand steadied the water pitcher through sheer force of will as she approached the table. Davies sat in his usual position, but tonight he was accompanied by a second man whose eyes catalogued the room with the same predatory assessment she'd seen in the false server. Davies looked up as she arrived, and for the first time since that night, his expression acknowledged their shared history. He gestured to the chair beside him with subtle command, an invitation that wasn't really optional, and she found herself sitting at the table instead of serving it. "The gift you gave me came with complications," Davies said quietly, his voice pitched below the ambient noise. His companion continued scanning the room, providing privacy through vigilance, and Sloane understood this conversation was happening in a bubble of manufactured security. He slid a manila envelope across the table, its contents creating a slight bulk that suggested photographs. Sloane's fingers trembled as she opened it, revealing surveillance images of herself, leaving campus, entering her building, visiting her mother's facility, each photo marked with timestamps and location data. "The organization that sent the false server has identified you as the failure point in their operation," Davies continued, his tone carrying the clinical detachment of someone discussing business logistics. "They've spent 3 weeks confirming your identity and establishing your patterns." The photographs continued in chronological sequence, showing angles of her apartment that should have been impossible to capture, images taken from positions that required planning and resources. The final photo showed her mother in the facility's garden, unaware that she'd been framed in a crosshair that existed beyond the camera lens. Davies produced a third envelope, this one containing pages of detailed surveillance reports written in clinical language that reduced her life to bullet points and timestamps. The documents chronicled her daily routines with disturbing accuracy, her morning coffee order, preferred study locations, the specific bench where she ate lunch between classes. Every pattern had been documented, every habit catalogued, creating a comprehensive map of vulnerabilities. "They've been watching for 3 weeks, Davies continued, his finger tracing the timeline documented in the reports. "Long enough to confirm you're not protected. Long enough to establish that taking you would be logistically simple. The only thing preventing action has been uncertainty about my response, whether I'd consider you worth the escalation." His companion leaned forward, adding context with the detachment of someone briefing military operations. "The Kuznetsov organization doesn't move without calculated risk assessment. They've lost 6 men in the past year to territorial disputes, so they're being strategic about their next move. You represent potential leverage without requiring direct confrontation." Sloane felt her breathing accelerate as the reality crystallized. She wasn't just incidental witness, but strategic asset in a conflict she'd stumbled into blindly. Her value existed purely in relation to Davies, and whether that value was worth protecting or eliminating remained the question driving every decision being made around her. Sloane's throat closed around questions that didn't matter, because Davies was already providing answers. His explanation unfolded with brutal efficiency. Rival families, territorial disputes, the mathematics of revenge that required eliminating anyone who disrupted carefully laid plans. "They won't approach while you're under my protection," he said, and the possessive pronoun carried weight that extended beyond simple grammar. "But protection requires proximity. You can't be safeguarded from a distance," his companion finally spoke, his voice carrying an accent that suggested Eastern European origins. "We've prevented 2 attempts already. They're patient, but they're committed. This doesn't end until we end it." Davies produced a second envelope, this one containing employment contracts, lease agreements, and legal documents that would fundamentally reorganize her existence. The offer emerged as inevitability rather than choice. Protected employment at an establishment he controlled, secured residence in a building his people monitored, Guaranteed care for her mother in a facility with actual security protocols. You'll work at our upscale location downtown. Clientele who understand discretion. Staff who know when to be selectively deaf. Davies's fingers tapped the contracts with measured rhythm. Your nursing degree continues on our schedule. Your mother receives care that exceeds anything Medicare provides. The alternative remained unspoken, but crystalline in its clarity. Remain an independent target hoping surveillance was sufficient, or accept the gilded cage that promised survival at the cost of autonomy. Sloane's hands shook as she reached for the pen he offered, understanding that signing meant crossing a threshold that had no return passage. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it, her voice raw with confusion and anger. You could have just eliminated the problem. I'm a liability who knows too much. Davies's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, something that might have been respect flickering in those winter-gray eyes. Your instinct saved my life when you had every reason to stay invisible. That kind of action without expectation of reward is rare in my world. He paused, his voice dropping further. Rare enough to protect. She signed the documents while her rational mind screamed warnings about contracts made under duress and choices that weren't really choices. Davies collected the papers with the satisfaction of someone who'd secured a valuable asset, and his companion finally relaxed his vigilant assessment of the dining room. Your shift officially starts tomorrow at the new location, Davies said as he stood, buttoning his suit jacket with practiced ease. Someone will help you move this weekend. Pack what matters. Everything else will be provided. He departed through the main entrance this time, his companion trailing at a professional distance, leaving Sloane alone at table 7 with the weight of what she'd just agreed to settling into her bones like permanent architecture. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of automatic service and racing thoughts. She served tables, collected payment, smiled at customers, all while feeling the ground shift beneath her feet like tectonic plates rearranging the landscape of her possible futures. The move happened with military efficiency on Saturday morning, 3 men arriving at her apartment with boxes and packing materials, their professional courtesy unable to disguise the fact that they were enforcers playing movers. They worked in coordinated silence, wrapping her modest belongings with care that felt more like inventory than assistance. Her new building stood in downtown Portland's renovated district, all glass and steel with a lobby that required keycard access through multiple checkpoints. The doorman nodded at her arrival with the recognition of someone who'd been briefed on her identity, his suit tailored to conceal what was certainly a shoulder holster. The apartment itself occupied the 8th floor with views of the Willamette River and security features disguised as luxury amenities. Sloane traced her fingers along the reinforced doorframe, recognizing bulletproof glass in windows marketed as energy efficient, understanding that her new home was fortress as much as residence. Her neighbors maintained the kind of studied indifference that suggested they understood the building's true nature. No one made eye contact in the elevator. No one lingered in hallways. And the sense of isolated proximity reminded her of witness protection without the federal oversight. The new restaurant location occupied a converted warehouse in the Pearl District, its exposed brick and Edison lighting creating ambiance that disguised its actual function. Sloane's orientation happened during a quiet Sunday afternoon, the manager explaining protocols that had nothing to do with food service. Certain tables are never photographed, he said, pointing to the private sections along the back wall. You'll develop selective deafness regarding conversations. Questions about clientele go unanswered, even to law enforcement without proper warrants. The staff moved with the awareness of people who understood their employment extended beyond hospitality. Sloane recognized former military bearing in the bartender, tactical assessment in how the hostess positioned herself near the entrance, the sense that everyone here had been recruited for capabilities that transcended their job descriptions. Her first shift began Tuesday evening with Davies absent, but his presence implicit in how management treated her. She received the premium section, the regulars who tipped in hundreds, and the unspoken understanding that her value extended beyond her ability to recommend wine pairings. The clientele spoke in careful euphemisms, business opportunities, that clearly meant territory, partnership restructuring, that involved violence, resource allocation, that probably ended in bodies. Sloane served them with practiced neutrality, her nursing training providing unexpected utility in reading stress indicators and potential volatility. She learned to recognize the power structure through subtle indicators, who arrived with security details, whose presence made others defer, which conversations paused when she approached, versus which continued as if she were furniture. The hierarchy revealed itself in glances and body language, a shadow government operating inside legitimate business, Her mother's confusion about the improved circumstances required increasingly elaborate lies. Sloane invented a scholarship with specific geographic requirements, a housing stipend tied to medical research participation, explanations that strained credulity, but provided comfort against alternatives too frightening to acknowledge. Visits to the assisted living facility now included escort vehicles that maintained discreet distances. Her mother never noticed the protection detail, but Sloane felt their presence like atmospheric pressure, constant, invisible, and fundamentally altering the environment around her. The anonymous phone remained her only direct connection to Davies' organization, receiving occasional texts with schedule changes or security updates. The messages arrived without sender identification, their tone professional and impersonal, treating her as asset rather than person. 3 weeks into her new routine, Davies appeared for a late dinner service. He occupied a corner table with 3 associates, their conversation intense enough to require her careful approach, and she felt his attention track her movement even while he spoke with the others. When she delivered their entrees, his hand briefly steadied her elbow as an associate's joke crossed professional boundaries. The touch lasted perhaps 2 seconds, but the message was clear. She existed under explicit protection, and violations would be addressed. The associate's immediate apology came with genuine fear, his eyes darting to Davies for confirmation of forgiveness. Sloane completed her service and retreated, understanding that she'd just witnessed the invisible boundaries that governed her new existence. The drive home that night happened in Davies' vehicle instead of her usual rideshare. No explanation was offered, just the rear door opening as she exited the restaurant and his driver's professional nod toward the interior. Davies sat in silence beside her as downtown Portland slid past bulletproof windows, the vehicle's interior carrying the scent of leather and expensive cologne. The quiet felt comfortable rather than tense, and Sloane found herself cataloging details, his precise posture, the way his fingers drummed against his knee in rhythm she couldn't identify, the fact that he seemed as contained by this situation as she was. "You're wasted in nursing," he said finally as they approached her building. "You think like us. Pattern recognition, threat assessment, the ability to act when others freeze." His voice carried something that might have been regret. "That's worth more than any medical degree." The federal agents arrived on a Thursday evening disguised as corporate clients celebrating a merger, their suits slightly wrong for Portland's culture, and their questions too strategic to be casual conversation. Sloane served their table with the same neutrality she'd cultivated for everyone else, but their attention lingered on her with the weight of investigative interest. "How long have you worked here?" the older agent asked, his smile friendly but his eyes cataloging her reactions. "Seems like a nice place." "Ownership local?" She provided responses carefully calibrated to reveal nothing while confirming nothing. Generic answers about management structure and hiring processes that could have described any restaurant. Her training in hypervigilance now served criminal enterprise, and the irony tasted bitter as she refilled their water glasses. The younger agent tried a different approach, commenting on the interesting clientele and the notable lack of online presence for such an upscale establishment. Sloane deflected with remarks about privacy-focused marketing and Portland's preference for word-of-mouth reputation, her performance polished enough to seem genuine. Davies appeared near the end of their meal, coincidentally passing their table to greet another guest. The agent's attention sharpened instantly, professional recognition sparking between law enforcement and its target. But the exchange remained cordial and brief. After the agents departed, Davies requested Sloane's presence in the private office behind the kitchen. The space was austere, desk, chairs, walls lined with what appeared to be legitimate business documents, but she recognized the reinforced door and the security monitors displaying every angle of the restaurant. "You handled that well," he said, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey without asking if she wanted one. "Federal task force investigating organized crime. They've been circling for months, looking for leverage." Sloane accepted the glass, her hands steadier than they should have been given the implications. "They'll be back." That wasn't reconnaissance. That was establishing contact. Davies' expression shifted into something that might have been approval. His winter gray eyes studying her with the intensity she'd learned meant she'd surprised him. "You're right, which is why your value just increased substantially." He took a measured sip. People who can think clearly under pressure are rare assets. The conversation expanded into territory she hadn't expected. Discussions of the organization's structure, territorial boundaries with rival families, the economics of criminal enterprise delivered with the clinical detachment of business analysis. Davies spoke as if she were colleague rather than employee, and Sloane found herself engaging with observations about security vulnerabilities and operational inefficiencies. "The northwest entrance needs better camera coverage," she said, surprising herself with the tactical assessment. "And your servers are positioned wrong for monitoring the private sections effectively." Davies leaned back in his chair, his smile devastating in its rarity. "See? Wasted in nursing." The weeks that followed saw her role expanding beyond traditional service. Davies included her in the card games hosted in private rooms, ostensibly as hostess but actually as additional observer. She served drinks while monitoring body language and tension levels, learning to read the subtle indicators that preceded violence or betrayal. The guests ranged from legitimate businessmen making illegitimate deals to criminals maintaining the veneer of respectability. Sloane moved among them with practiced invisibility, her presence registered but dismissed, and she collected information simply by existing in spaces where secrets were currency. One evening, during a particularly tense negotiation over territory in southeast Portland, an associate's attention became inappropriate. His hand lingered too long when she delivered his bourbon, his comments crossing professional boundaries into predatory suggestion. Davies's response was surgical in its precision, a quiet word that made the man's face drain of color, followed by immediate departure despite the negotiation being unfinished. The remaining guests continued as if nothing had happened, but the message was clear enough that even Sloane felt its implications. Later, as she collected empty glasses from the now vacant room, Davies spoke from the doorway. "No one touches what's mine." The possessive statement should have triggered her resistance, but instead it settled into her awareness as complicated truth. She existed in his protection, under his authority, claimed by circumstances that had started with 9 words on a napkin. The drive home that night happened in his vehicle again, the pattern becoming established routine. Davies sat beside her in the back seat, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, distant enough to maintain the professional boundaries that governed their impossible relationship. "You should know that your involvement has consequences," he said as they approached her building. "The federal attention isn't coincidental. They believe you're leverage, someone I care about protecting." Sloane turned to face him in the vehicle's dim interior, finding his expression unreadable in the passing streetlights. "Do you?" His answer came after a pause measured in heartbeats. "More than strategy suggests I should." His fingers brushed hers briefly on the seat between them, the touch electric and over too quickly. "Which makes you both asset and liability." She exited the vehicle with that admission burning through her awareness, understanding finally that the protection wasn't purely transactional. Something had shifted between saving his life and this moment, a connection forged through violence and necessity that neither of them seemed able to categorize. Her apartment felt emptier than usual that night, the luxury amenities unable to compensate for the isolation that came with existing in Davies's orbit. Sloane stood at her window watching the city lights, and wondering when she'd stopped being prisoner and started being willing participant. The call came at 2 a.m, the anonymous phone's vibration pulling Sloane from restless sleep into immediate alertness. Her mother's assisted living facility identified itself through the caller ID before she even answered, and ice flooded her veins with the certainty that protection had failed. "Your mother is safe," the night supervisor said quickly, anticipating panic. "But we had an incident. Someone attempted unauthorized access to her wing. Security protocols prevented entry, but we've contacted the police and thought you should know immediately." Sloane was dressed and moving before the call ended, her hands shaking as she pulled on clothes and grabbed her keys. The anonymous phone buzzed again, a text with just an address and the word "car waiting," and she realized Davies' network had been monitoring the facility's communications. The vehicle idling outside her building was armored luxury, its driver emerging to open her door with professional efficiency. She'd barely settled into the back seat when Davies slid in beside her, his presence unexpected, but somehow inevitable given the circumstances. "Your mother's floor is locked down," he said without preamble, as the vehicle accelerated through empty streets. "My people arrived before police. The individual attempting access fled, but we have security footage and identification." The convoy, because she now realized multiple vehicles were moving in formation, crossed Portland with the kind of speed that ignored traffic laws. Davies made calls in clipped sentences, coordinating responses that suggested his organization had more reach than any legitimate security company. They arrived at the facility to find it transformed into a fortified position. Men in suits that couldn't quite conceal tactical gear-monitored entrances, and the night supervisor looked simultaneously relieved and terrified by the private security presence that had superseded official protocols. Sloane's mother sat in her room, confused by the commotion, but mercifully unaware of actual danger. She brightened when her daughter arrived, asking questions about the early visit that Sloane deflected with invented stories about schedule changes and surprise inspections. Davies waited in the hallway, speaking quietly with his security chief while reviewing footage on a tablet. When Sloane emerged after settling her mother back to sleep, his expression carried the cold fury she'd only seen glimpses of before. "Mikhail Sokolov," he said, turning the tablet to show her a frozen frame of a man in maintenance coveralls. "Bratva Enforcer. The rival organization contracted outside their usual network, which means they're escalating beyond local resources." The conference room they commandeered held an emergency meeting that looked more like military briefing than security consultation. Davies' senior associates arrived in rapid succession, their faces grim as they reviewed the attempted breach and its implications. "She's exposed," one associate argued, his accent carrying traces of Italian heritage. "They've identified the mother as pressure point. Next attempt won't be reconnaissance. It'll be acquisition for leverage." Davies' response cut through the debate with absolute authority. "Then we eliminate the vulnerability. Full protective detail on the facility, transfer to secured medical residence, and active countermeasures against Bratva operations in our territory." The discussion that followed used language that made Sloane's nursing ethics training recoil: surgical strikes, and message sending, and proportional response, that clearly meant violence calculated to deter future attempts. She sat in the corner, officially ignored but actually central to every decision being made. "This is my fault," she said finally, her voice cutting through the strategic planning. "I saw a threat and acted. Everything since then has been consequences of that choice." The room fell silent, associates exchanging glances that suggested civilians rarely interrupted operational discussions. But Davies turned to face her fully, his winter-gray eyes holding something that might have been understanding. "You saved my life when logic said to stay invisible," he said quietly. "That action has value beyond tactical considerations. What's happening now isn't your fault. It's the cost of operating in a world where every move generates countermoves." His associate with the Italian accent spoke again, his tone gentler than before. "In our world, Miss Sloane, debts are paid in protection or blood. You're owed the former, which means we provide it regardless of complications." The meeting continued past dawn, strategies forming that would fundamentally alter her mother's living situation and Sloane's remaining illusions about returning to normal life. Davies coordinated transfers to a private medical residence that his organization controlled, staffed by nurses who understood that patient care sometimes required tactical awareness. When the associates finally departed with their assignments, Davies remained in the conference room with Sloane as pale morning light filtered through the blinds. Exhaustion lined both their faces, but his attention stayed sharp as he studied her with the intensity she'd learned meant important conversations approaching. "You need to understand what you've become to this organization," he said, his voice carrying weight beyond the words. "You're not just protected employee or grateful obligation. Your ability to see threats, to act without hesitation, that makes you valuable in ways that extend beyond your original intention." Sloane felt anger finally surfacing through the fear and exhaustion. "I didn't ask to become asset in your war. I just wanted to prevent violence in a restaurant where I was trying to earn tuition money." "I know," Davies said, and something in his expression cracked the professional mask he typically maintained. "Which is exactly why I can't let you go. People who act from conscience instead of calculation are rare enough in legitimate society. In my world, they're practically extinct." His admission hung between them in the quiet room, acknowledgement of the cage he'd constructed around her, even as he claimed to be providing protection. Sloane understood finally that there was no exit from this situation, no return to the life she'd been building before 9 words on a napkin had changed everything. "I hate that the only way to keep you breathing is to lock you in my world," Davies continued, his voice rougher than she'd heard before. "But I hate the alternative more." The plan formed over the following week, with the kind of meticulous detail that suggested Davies' organization had orchestrated similar operations before. Sloane's upcoming nursing school graduation ceremony would serve as controlled exposure, bait that drew rivals into an environment where every variable could be managed and every attendee could be screened. Her initial resistance to using her graduation as tactical opportunity met Davies' immovable insistence that hiding indefinitely wasn't sustainable strategy. "They'll keep probing until they find an opening," he explained during a late-night planning session. "Better to control the circumstances than wait for them to choose the battleground." The university's event coordinator received anonymous donation that covered security upgrades for the ceremony, metal detectors framed as standard protocol, additional campus police presented as celebration of graduating class size. No one questioned the enhanced measures, and Sloane watched her academic achievement transform into military operation. Her mother's attendance required its own logistical nightmare, medical transport staffed by Davies's people, seating positioned for optimal security sightlines, and contingency plans for rapid extraction if the situation deteriorated. The level of coordination made Sloane's chest tight with the weight of what her life had become. Davies insisted on attending personally despite his security chief's protests about unnecessary exposure. "She's graduating with honors while managing circumstances that would destroy most people," he said during a briefing Sloane wasn't supposed to overhear. "I'm going to be there." The ceremony day arrived with June sunshine and the kind of nervous energy that preceded both celebrations and combat operations. Sloane dressed in her graduation gown, while her apartment filled with the subtle presence of security personnel conducting final sweeps and communication checks. The ride to campus happened in Davies's armored vehicle, his presence in formal suit that somehow made him look more dangerous rather than less. He sat beside her reviewing security updates on his phone, but his free hand found hers on the seat between them, fingers interlacing with gentle pressure. "Whatever happens today," he said quietly as they approached the university, "you earned this degree through work that had nothing to do with my world. Remember that." The ceremony space held hundreds of attendees, proud families, restless graduates, faculty in academic regalia, and Sloane's trained observation now cataloged them all as potential threats. Her hypervigilance, once a burden inherited from her mother's trauma, had become operational necessity. Davies positioned himself in the middle section with clear sightlines to the stage and main exits. His people scattered throughout the venue in formations that looked random but provided comprehensive coverage, and Sloane felt the invisible net of protection surrounding her, even as she lined up with fellow graduates. The recognition came during the processional as graduates filed toward their seats. A face in the crowd matched surveillance photos she'd been shown during security briefings: angular features, pale eyes, the particular stillness of someone waiting for optimal moment to act. Sloane's hand moved to adjust her honor cord, a gesture that looked like nervous fidgeting, but signaled Davies's security detail about threat location. She saw the ripple of response, people shifting positions, hands moving toward concealed weapons, the net tightening around the identified target. 2 more faces emerged from the crowd as she took her seat, their positioning creating triangulated coverage of the stage area. The Bratva had sent a team, and Sloane realized with cold clarity that she was watching an assassination attempt unfold in real time among families celebrating their children's achievements. The ceremony proceeded with surreal normalcy: welcome speeches, faculty addresses, the slow progression through hundreds of names. Sloane's heart hammered as her row stood to approach the stage, her peripheral vision tracking Davies's subtle hand signals to his distributed team. Her name was called, and she walked across the stage to receive her diploma, while armed operatives from rival criminal organizations positioned themselves for violence in a crowd of civilians. The disconnect between achievement and danger made her vision narrow, but she forced herself to smile for the photographer and shake the dean's hand. Davies's team moved during her walk back to her seat, their actions invisible to most attendees but clear to anyone trained to recognize coordinated tactical response. The 3 identified threats found themselves suddenly flanked by men whose postures suggested immediate consequences for any aggressive movement. The extraction happened with surgical precision. Identified operatives guided toward exits with the firm politeness of event security, their protests dying when they recognized the firepower surrounding them. Campus police, coordinated through channels Sloane didn't want to examine too closely, intercepted them at building perimeters. The ceremony continued without interruption, but Sloane watched through the remainder in a state of heightened awareness that made every sound feel amplified. Her mother, seated with Davies's protection detail, remained blissfully unaware of how close her daughter had come to becoming leverage in a war conducted beneath society's surface. When the ceremony finally concluded with the traditional cap toss, Sloane felt exhaustion crash over her like physical force. She'd graduated with honors while serving as bait in a criminal operation, and the achievement felt hollow against the reality of what her life had become. The processing happened in a secured facility that Davies's organization maintained for exactly these situations: anonymous industrial building with interrogation rooms and holding cells that existed outside official law enforcement channels. Sloane wasn't supposed to be present, but Davies had made exception to rules she was beginning to understand he rarely bent. The 3 captured operatives sat in separate rooms, their initial bravado fading as hours passed without the rescue or legal intervention they'd expected. Davies conducted the interrogations personally, his questions precise and his patience infinite, extracting information through psychological pressure rather than physical violence. Sokolov contracted them for acquisition, not elimination, Davies explained to Sloane during a break between sessions. They were supposed to take you during the ceremony confusion, use you as negotiating position to force territorial concessions. The revelation settled into Sloane's awareness, with the weight of confirmed fears. She'd become commodity in negotiations she didn't understand, her value measured in criminal territory and organizational leverage, rather than anything connected to her actual identity. "What happens to them?" she asked, though part of her didn't want the answer. Davies's expression carried the cold calculation she'd learned meant decisions had already been made. "They'll be returned to Bratva leadership with clear message about consequences for targeting my people. The deaths will look like internal conflict, bodies found in locations that suggest factional disputes, rather than external retaliation." The casual discussion of murder should have horrified her, but Sloane found herself mostly feeling exhausted relief that the immediate threat was being neutralized. Her moral framework, carefully constructed through nursing ethics, and her mother's anxious teachings about right and wrong, had eroded into pragmatic acceptance of violence as necessary currency. Davies drove her home himself that night, dismissing his security detail with the kind of confidence that suggested he trusted his own capabilities more than coordinated protection. The vehicle moved through Portland's evening streets while silence stretched between them, heavy with things neither seemed able to articulate. "I've become what I despised," he said finally as they approached her building. "Someone who risks you for strategic advantage. Using you as bait violated every rule I set about your protection." Sloane turned to face him in the vehicle's dim interior, finding vulnerability in his expression that she'd never witnessed before. "You think I didn't know what I was agreeing to? I'm not naive enough to believe I had real choice, but I understood the plan. That doesn't make it acceptable," Davies said, his voice rough with something that might have been self-recrimination. "You should be starting your nursing career, building the normal life you worked for, not serving as operational asset in criminal enterprise." The admission hung between them, acknowledging the impossible position they both occupied. Sloane reached across the seat to take his hand, feeling the tension in his fingers before they relaxed into her grip. "You want to know what I learned in nursing school?" she said quietly. "That sometimes you can't fix the underlying condition. You can only manage symptoms and prevent deterioration. Maybe that's what this is." Davies's laugh carried bitter recognition. "Are you really comparing our situation to palliative care?" "I'm saying that I recognized you that night in the restaurant," Sloane continued, her voice steady despite the confession's weight. "Someone who lives in the space between danger and control, who sees threats because they have to, rather than because they want to. We're both damaged in similar ways." His fingers tightened around hers, and the distance between them closed as he leaned forward. The kiss was gentle despite everything between them, carrying acknowledgement of the impossible relationship they'd constructed through violence and necessity. "I don't have normal life to offer," Davies said when they finally separated. "Just complicated shelter and the certainty that I'll eliminate anyone who threatens you." "I know," Sloane said, and realized she'd made peace with that truth somewhere between graduation ceremony and this moment. "But I also know that I'd rather have honest darkness than pretend safety." The weeks that followed established new equilibrium in their impossible partnership. Sloane began working at the clinic Davies's organization funded, medical practice serving populations who couldn't or wouldn't seek conventional care, treating gunshot wounds without police reports, and providing addiction services to people the system had abandoned. Her nursing degree finally served its intended purpose, though the patient population looked nothing like her textbooks had prepared her for. She sutured knife wounds while gang members stood guard, administered antibiotics to prostitutes whose pimps would have prevented hospital visits, and learned that healthcare in Davies's world required flexible ethics and selective blindness. The clinic operated in a converted warehouse space that had been retrofitted with medical equipment that rivaled many legitimate hospitals. Davies's investment in the facility reflected genuine commitment to providing care for populations society had abandoned, though his motivations blended pragmatism with something that might have been conscience. Healthy workers were productive workers, and loyalty bought through competent healthcare ran deeper than fear alone could generate. Sloane's colleagues at the clinic included 2 other nurses with similar stories of circumstantial recruitment, a doctor who'd lost his license over prescription irregularities but retained brilliant diagnostic skills, and a physician assistant who'd fled domestic violence into Davies' protection. They formed an unlikely medical team, bound by shared understanding that conventional paths had closed, leaving only these alternative arrangements. Her first month treating gunshot wounds without mandatory reporting felt like crossing an ethical line she couldn't uncross. But watching a 19-year-old survive because he could seek treatment without police involvement complicated her judgment about right and wrong. The kid had been caught in crossfire, innocent except for being in the wrong neighborhood, and her care had saved his life where hospital protocols might have cost it. Davies visited the clinic periodically, his presence transforming staff nervousness into focused efficiency. He reviewed operations with the attention of someone who understood medical practice despite having no formal training, asking questions about supply chains and patient outcomes that revealed genuine investment beyond financial considerations. Sloan watched him interact with patients who feared and respected him in equal measure, and understood that his power came from being both threat and protection. Davies formalized her role as security consultant, valuing her observational skills in identifying vulnerabilities within his operations. She reviewed establishment layouts, assessed personnel for reliability indicators, and provided the kind of threat analysis that came naturally from her hypervigilant awareness. Her mother's care in the secured medical residence exceeded anything Sloan could have provided through legitimate channels. The staff treated her mother's anxiety disorder with compassionate expertise, and the improved stability allowed their relationship to heal wounds that poverty and fear had created. 6 months after her graduation, Sloan found herself back at Aurelio's original location for Wednesday dinner service. The restaurant had been fully restored, operating exactly as it had before, the night that changed everything, and Davies occupied table 7 with familiar precision. She approached with water service, placing the glass exactly where he preferred it, their eyes meeting with acknowledgement of everything that had passed between that first warning and this moment. He'd ordered his standard bourbon neat, opened his leather journal, and waited for her to complete the ritual. Sloan placed a folded napkin beneath his hand, mimicking that original gesture, but inverting its meaning. Davies lifted it to reveal a single word written in her precise handwriting. Safe. His hand covered hers briefly on the table, the touch lasting just long enough to convey what words couldn't adequately express. They existed in impossible balance. 2 damaged people who'd found shelter in shared darkness, their partnership forged through violence but sustained by recognition of similar wounds. The city moved around them as it always had, legitimate society flowing above the criminal infrastructure that supported it, and Sloan understood finally that she'd chosen this life as much as it had chosen her. Not the future she'd imagined during nursing school applications, but perhaps the one her hyper-vigilant awareness had been preparing her for all along. They walked together through Portland's evening streets after her shift ended, Davies' presence no longer a cage but complicated protection, her vigilance now defending what she'd chosen, rather than what she'd survived. The space between them held understanding that conventional relationships could never accommodate. 2 people who'd found equilibrium in darkness they both understood. Thank you all for following this story. If you're enjoying it, write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the video. Your support means everything and helps me continue bringing you these stories. Until next time, stay safe out there.